the phrase, what gets measured gets managed. And that's sort of part of what we're talking about here today, is by cognizantly choosing and defining how we measure things like prosperity and success and growth, and how we choose our metrics and establish our baselines and look at where we're going, are the sorts of things within our businesses or our lives or our communities that get managed appropriately. If my sole metric for measuring my business success is my traditional profit, how am I expected to manage social ramifications or environmental impact? I've got to have solid metrics around that. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is this sort of new paradigm that's driving business decision making and business strategic initiatives around sustainability. So the paramount question is, are we measuring ever increasing economic growth, or are we looking at this idea of development? And in both your papers and your quizzes for Unit 1, we had some pretty robust dialogue around what's happening with unchecked economic growth. And I find that so many, not just young people, but just folks in general, feel like we're doing well if we have this, this trajectory of upward charting economic growth. And certainly we need to be identifying what that looks like. And is it solely the increase in the value of goods and services? Or might it be more looking at this term of economic development, which is what's the well-being of the inhabitants of the country looking like, or the business, or the community? And when you talk about inhabitants, might that also mean something other than humans? So let's just stop and think about this for a second. When's the last time you heard a policy leader talk about measuring economic development versus pure growth? We usually speak in percentiles of economic growth on a quarterly basis, or this quarter we increased our economic growth 1% over last quarter or last year at this time. And what if we expanded that definition and looked at something much more holistic and much more all-encompassing societally and environmentally? In addition, clearly, to traditional measurements of economic growth like jobs and GDP. So the question is, what do we want to measure, and what gives us the most tangible results about what our policies and our initiatives are doing for the well-being of our citizenry? So can you give me, can we just talk for a couple minutes and see if we can generate together some ideas about what current measurements are of success? What are some current measurements? What do we look at in a traditional capitalistic lens that measures our success?
Well, GDP.
GDP growth, gross domestic product, right? We're going to talk about that.
Employment rates.
Employment rates, absolutely. A number of jobs added. Now, number of jobs added, I think in, what just came out? Was it July or August? It must have been August it just came out. And I think it was over 200,000 new jobs were added to the economy, right? Does that say anything about economic well-being? Do we know what those jobs were? Do we know if they were living wage jobs? Do we know if they were temporary or permanent jobs? Right, so just looking at something, for example, the Keystone Pipeline, there's lots of discussion about how many, what it was going to do as far as economic stimulation, how many jobs were going to be added, right? And certainly there's a number of quite high-paying short-term jobs, right? Construction jobs. But as far as long-term, permanent, sustainable type jobs, the number was I think it was 20% of the number that was given in the short term. So jobs added, employment rates, or unemployment rates more accurately, GDP, what else? What are some other measurements?
Inflation.
Inflation rates. Excellent. Well, how much purchasing power do we have? Right? And we call that CPI, Consumer Price Index.
And then, I can't remember what it's called, but it's something to do with the strength of our dollar.
Like our exchange rates?
Yeah, I can't think of the word for it, but when our money, the value of our money goes up and down.
Okay, I don't have a term off the top of my head for that. I'd have to look that up. I think of that like as the strength of the dollar is measured in valuation of currency or exchange rates, how we measure against the yuan, for example, the Chinese currency, or the yen, the Japanese currency.
Yeah, maybe that does relate to purchasing power, because when the dollar is weaker.
That more has to do with international trade balances.
Okay.
What about the stock market? What do we look at in the stock market? What sorts of numbers or phrases do you hear bandied about there?
Dow Jones.
Yeah, what's the Dow Jones Industrial Average? Absolutely.
Whether you're in a bear or a
Bull market.
Yeah, are you in a bear or a bull market? Are stocks booming or are they deflating? What about the S&P 500? Have you ever heard of that? The Standard & Poor's 500? The biggest 500 companies on the Dow Jones?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Standard and Poor's.
Standard & Poor's S&P 500.
and just the index funds, like whether the whole index is up or the whole index is
Yeah,
down.
the NASDAQ. How's the NASDAQ doing? Those are tech funds generally.
Would like wealth inequality, like how many people are below like low average or like low income?
Yeah, poverty rates and poverty levels, absolutely. So there's really this is great, robust discussion. There's a wide gamut of metrics out there around pretty much economic growth, right? But how indicative are, for one thing, can you take any of those out, extricate any of those measurements out by themselves and say that's an indicator of well-being? You know, you really need this kind of enmeshment of lots of different indicators, don't you?
Right.
So let's see if we can just take a peek at some potential here. So one of the primary measurements are GDP, and I chose this to talk about because we read a Costanza piece, the Bob Costanza piece, on GDP versus GPI. And this isn't the only metric by any extension of thought, because we just talked about a number of them, but this is one of the most prevalent. So it's used to gauge the health of a country or a community's economy. And so first off, we should know what is it. So it's the total dollar value of all, basically of all output, of all goods and services. So if you tally up the value of all your products and the value of all your services in your country, that is the baseline for GDP. And you have to make two adjustments. Minus the total consumer investment and government spending. You've got the value of all your output minus what was spent plus the value of your net exports. So it looks at everything from value added to manufacturing output minus what is consumed and subsidized by government plus your net exports, i.e. exports minus imports. And you most often hear it expressed as a comparison to the prior quarter of the year. GDP is up 3%, GDP is down 0.8%. So it's basically a metric of how fast the economy is growing. What do you feel that you hear from our policymakers as pertains to GDP? I mean, when a politician stands in front of you, he or she is usually running on some platform that says, I'm going to do what?
Increases.
I'm going to increase GDP at a more rapid rate than the other guy or gal, right?
Right.
And if you don't question that basic premise, it'd be fair then to go to the next step and measure his or her success based on that statement, wouldn't it?
It's associated with a booming economy, right? I mean,
It's associated with more people working, lower unemployment rates, etc. But it's back to the question, does it say anything about living wage, social inequalities, permanence or level of professionalism? That's not really quite the right term I want, but it doesn't say anything about the quality of the work or the number of jobs somebody is actually being employed at to make ends meet. Okay? It doesn't address any of that. So let's look at what the actual gentleman, well, there's a historical slide, and then the gentleman that actually designed GDP. So GDP was a term that first came about in the 40s at a place called Bretton Woods, which was sort of the eve of the end of World War II. A number of industrialists and world leaders, Winston Churchill and FDR, and the Rothschilds and the Astors and some very, very big international names in manufacturing came together in this thing called the UN Monetary and Financial Conference at a place called Bretton Woods. And this idea of GDP was sort of birthed at this conference. And basically, the whole purpose of this conference was to stimulate international trade on the theory that if countries were trading with each other, they wouldn't go to war. Because we just basically blown each other to smithereens twice in the last 25 years. And we're sort of globally becoming cognizant that this may not be the best way forward in perpetuity. Okay, so this was designed around integrating global trade, and a lot of people will argue this was the beginning of globalism. But what we weren't thinking about on the eve of the end of World War II, so I think it was 1945, that Bretton Woods was, what we weren't really thinking about at all was social or environmental degradation at that point in time. Not that it wasn't happening, it just wasn't center stage because of the fact that we'd had two world wars in the last 25 years. So it was all focused on economic impact and really zero attention paid to social or environmental degradation. So it was never, my point being, it was never intended to measure well-being. It was always intended to have this really static, finite measurement around economic trade and the impacts of that. So and the other thing it doesn't do, and I'm going to make a pretty strong case for this, I think, is it doesn't distinguish between costs and benefits. And most of us deal with costs and benefits in our daily decisions all the time. I really want to eat organic, I want the benefits of it, but the cost's really high. So is there a payoff for me, right? I really want to own a car, but it's going to cost so much, so are the benefits there for me, or can I make do with mass transport in my bike? So it's this concept we're talking about today is asking us to analyze if money is being spent, i.e. GDP is increasing, then social well-being is increasing, right? Mm-hmm. And are those necessarily variables that move on the same sequencing, on the same graphing? And we're going to talk about where this argument falls short. So the gentleman that at Bretton Woods was an economist, Simon Kuznets, and he basically even said at Bretton Woods, post Bretton Woods, in the 70s he made this statement, that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income, which is exactly what GDP does, and which is exactly what our policymakers do. The economy's growing, everything's great, re-elect me. But goals for more growth should specify what sort of growth and to what ends, for what purpose. Okay? So is it the consolidation of wealth in the top 1%? I think everybody would say no. How's that gonna help me, little man, right? So what is the goal of more growth? What specifically are we looking to grow? If we're looking to grow health and welfare and well-being and community solvency, those are viable goals. If we're just looking to increase wealth for the sake of increasing wealth when we know that the disparity is increasing along with that wealth, is that a viable goal? And he makes the argument, this is a guy that designed the metric, that's not desirable. So in the metric, you add up all the money we spend and call it economic growth. Well, we're going to make a pretty strong case here why that's not a solid objective. And there's no distinction between desirable or undesirable expenditures. So, for example, if I go engage in open pit mining, that's the value of the ore that's extracted and sold is clearly going to raise GDP. And then 15 years later, I've got to go expend $100 million to clean it up. Guess what that does too? Increases GDP, because that's a product or service, right?
Yeah.
So you see how there's no, it's like, I'm going to sell you cigarettes and then I'm going to sell you medical care for lung cancer and nicotine patches. Those all go in as positives to GDP, right? So there's no differentiation between desirable or undesirable output. And it also ignores everything that happens outside the parameters of currency. Like, I only work 20 hours a week because my ancient Nana lives with us and I take care of her. That doesn't go into GDP, but clearly enhances community welfare. If she was in a assisted living facility, that would go into GDP, but the fact that I'm taking care of my Nana doesn't. So you see how there's so many things that aren't measured through this metric that we rely on? So the query today is, should we be moving from purely economic metrics to triple bottom line? And we've identified, I don't think I've maybe ever written TBL up there. Have I written triple bottom line? I know I've talked to you about the 3 Ps, but I don't know if I've ever identified triple bottom line as the model that incorporates these 3 big pools of metrics.
I know you've mentioned it, but I don't think you went into that much.
Into depth. Okay, so that's essentially what it is. Triple bottom line is a way of measuring success of a business, a community, even really a family household, based on these 3 pools. And the pools are, how well am I doing with social justice and social stewardship, i.e. people? How benign am I being on the environment, or am I even maybe rejuvenating the environment I operate in, i.e. planet? And then, of course, in order to be sustainable, you've got to be profitable. Money's not a dirty word. We have to be financially solvent in order to engage in social and environmental stewardship. Sometimes the 3 Ps are called the 3 Es. That was how I was first introduced to it, but I find those a little harder to remember. Economics, environment, and equity. But it's the same thing, people, planet, profit. Right? Obviously, economics is profit, environment is planet, and equity is people. So you see it in the literature, written sort of interchangeably using these 3 terms: triple bottom line, people, planet, profit, or 3 Es. So, I mean, I guess the magic question is if we're making a case for moving from purely economic metrics more to the triple bottom line, what do these metrics look like? Who measures them? How do we authenticate them? How do we make them comparable? All the things that we like in our financial data. And I'm a CPA by trade, so I'm all about, like, I want to know where the data comes from. I want to know that I can replicate it if I run the numbers myself. Now all of a sudden we're opening this can of worms and saying, well, we're going to measure the social justice in your company, Kraft or Heinz or IBM. How are we going to do that? And you're going to tell me, I treat my employees great. They all smile when they come to work. And I'm going to say, oh no, I want quantitative data that shows how you assess the well-being of your people. Or I want to see your water footprint to show really how water intensive your company is. And all of a sudden, I'm not just getting my metrics from CPAs and accounting firms. I need hydrologists and social scientists and wildlife biologists to measure the biodiversity impact of putting up new manufacturing plants in a Kentucky wetland. See how incredibly complex this has already gotten? Super exciting. If I was a young person, this would be an area I would totally be going into, because it takes all the pragmatism of financial metrics and then it adds on these other elements of people and planet that makes a whole picture of a company. And now I can say to you, do you want to be employed with my firm? Do you want to invest in my firm? Do you want to do business with my firm as a vendor? Let me show you how we measure out on all three of these pools. So, I mean, obviously the controversy is very, very wide around if we're moving away from, or moving away, past GDP. What does it look like? Are we adjusting it? Are we coming up with brand new indicators? Are we doing some sort of weighted composite of all the things I was just talking about? Some social, some environmental, some profit oriented. And this is just a tiny snapshot of the potential. In here, in this lecture, in this unit, I have chosen to talk about one of the indicators that adjust GDP. And when I say adjust something, I mean it starts with GDP and then it adds and subtracts things to come to a different metric. You read about that in the Costanza piece. It's called Genuine Progress Indicator, GPI. We're looking at the first three of the indicators that replace GDP. Where I had you take a look at the Human Development Index. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on ecological footprinting. And then we're also going to take a peek at Happy Planet Index. And I haven't specifically looked at any of the indicators that are supplementing GDP. But I'm just trying to get you, this is a pretty vast topic, I'm just trying to get you to think about, gosh, if we don't feel like this metric any longer suits our holistic needs to measure economic well-being, what do we use then? And these are just some different categories of options. Any comments so far?
It is complex.
There's a lot going on. Violet?
I just have a quick question. I feel like it's hard for like a company to gather specifically quantitative data on things like social well-being of their employees, because that's inherently more of a qualitative thing.
Right.
Do you have any like examples of like a good way to do something like that?
We do. We actually have something called social footprinting. So almost, I guess, a buzzword is anything that you want to measure in the sustainable development world. Now you can put that word and then tack on footprinting. So for example, social footprinting is a way of measuring really concrete things within your company, like pay equity, like number of minorities and women and disabled in executive management positions, like your whistleblowing policy and what percentage of your people take advantage of those mechanisms. In other words, you've got a transparent environment. So it's not like, hey Violet, do you like working at 3M? Right, because that is qualitative data. I mean, facetious, obviously. The instrument's much more technically scoped than that. But by nature, anything where you have human beings integrated, you tend towards qualitative data. But that's really hard to replicate and make comparable between companies, because if you work for a chemical company and I work for the World Wildlife Fund, technically there should be data that measures our well-being in our institutions without taking into consideration the fact that your company, puts toxins into the environment and mine saves panda bears, right? So, I mean, again, I'd be an extreme. But, so it's those kinds of metrics I was just telling you about. Good question.
So are we talking more about the footprint on Friday? 'Cause
Yes.
Okay, then I'll.
On the ecological footprint?
Well, I didn't understand what the footprint effect is per se, as far as,
Does it basically mean your impact, your footprint?
Footprint generally means impact. Yeah, that's a great one-word synthesis of it.
okay.
Okay, thanks.
Footprint, yeah. What's my water impact? And you measure it by blue, gray, and black water impact. What's my social impact? Do my women make as much as my men? Are my minorities represented on my executive team and my board of directors? Carbon footprint, how much do I emit? Plastic footprint, I just learned that term last week. How much plastic waste do I generate in my company on an annual basis? And then hopefully you're starting to see already that regardless of what kind of company you're in, you can start to compare them, right? You can take a chemical company and the World Wildlife Fund and Monsanto and Texas Instruments and Boeing, and all of a sudden you can look at reports and metrics that allow you to compare as an investor, a potential employee, a vendor, a funder, a credit source. You can start to compare these companies. You see where we're going with this? Rather than just, what's their gross revenue? What's their profit margins? That's a piece of it, clearly, but that's not all of it. Sustainable development metrics, here's your formal definition. They're tools that measure the benefits, or not, of implementing sustainability initiatives, sustainable initiatives. So these are our tools, our instruments, our data compilers that measure, or not, the benefits achieved through implementing sustainable initiatives. So if I go into my warehouse and spend $10,000 retrofitting my T1 lights, right? Whenever you walk in somewhere and lights are buzzing, that's inefficient energy. That's dissipated energy, right? That's carbon going into the environment that's doing absolutely nothing as far as lighting the room you're in. So I go retrofit my warehouse, and I can concretely look at what I spent. It's $10,000. I wrote a check for the invoice. What am I expecting to see for my sustainable initiative?
Reduction in energy?
I want to be able to look at my energy bills down the road and say, I'm using, 180,000 less kilowatts than I was before. Now I can do two things with that measurement. There's a hard number that goes with reducing that energy bill by 180,000 kilowatts, but I can also throw it in a carbon converter and see how much it's decreased my carbon emissions. Wow. Same thing with water. I go in and I'm a water intensive company. Any company that does any sort of, the guys that make these chairs, you finish these off with some sort of solvent or hardener, and they're very water intensive processes. So I go in and I install new pumps, water pumps. They're more energy efficient and they reduce the amount of gallons per minute, GPM, that comes out of my line to finish harden my chairs. Now what can I measure? I can measure what it costs me. I can measure the reduction in water that I'm using, which decreases my water footprint, and also my cost, because water costs money. Industrial water costs money. And it reduces my carbon emissions, and it reduces my energy bill. So now this one initiative of changing out some pumps has got all sorts of other metrics attached to it. Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah. There was that one article that we read about where they did that with the pumps and it cut their energy costs by 75%. It was just inefficient design.
It's all in the design. You really should have a whole class on just biomimicry and design. We mentioned it just sort of in passing in here.
Yeah.
But, so these SD metrics, sustainable development metrics, measure how well our financial inputs result in social and environmental outputs. And I just gave you a couple examples. Many of them will come back to design.
There's just one other thing.
Go ahead,
I don't know if anybody
please.
else has noticed this, but when I'm printing emails, I start wondering if somebody's in like cahoots with the paper companies, because I'll print an email and it will print the main page and then it prints the second page with maybe a tiny bit of something on top.
Yeah.
And it happens almost all the time, so that I'm really conscious of making sure I only print the one page, because it always kicks out another page with just a little print on it.
And here's the thing, like, you go in to consult with a business on sustainability, and like, one of the first easy, it's called low-hanging fruit that you do, is like, if they're not already paperless, or paper light, as people call themselves now, let's go reset the margins in Word, and let's make sure that you've got a printer that can handle double-sided printing. And it cut your paper costs right off the get-go by 60%. So you just paid for my fee. Just walk in the door and reset your margins and make sure your printer goes double-sided. Or that all your people are trained on hopefully not having to print emails, but if they do,
Right.
how do you make sure that you only print the meat of what you need? Those very, very simple mechanisms just are not integrated policy for a lot of companies. Super easy.
Right. It happens with bills or like invoices too, that if you have to print out an invoice, a lot of times it will print out 2 pages without
Sure.
it being necessary.
Yeah.
142.
Thank you. I'm going to finish this. So back to answering your question, Violet, this is a whole list of qualitative data that we can also garner from our social well-being metrics, but that are less comparable. And you have less of an ability to take that. I can use this as recruiting material. If I'm Patagonia, I've got 3,000 people for every one person I hire. Everybody wants to work in Patagonia because, I mean, just go down the list here. But it's not as easy to compare. Okay, we will, how far did we get on this? About halfway. We will continue this discussion on Friday.